June 4, 1942. 10,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean. Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky stares at an empty sea where 4 Japanese aircraft carriers should be. His fuel gauge reads critical. 30 SBD Dauntless dive bombers follow behind him, their tanks just as empty. Turn back now and they might make it home. Maybe. But somewhere below this endless blue, the most powerful carrier strike force ever assembled is hunting for the American fleet. McClusky has one choice: find them in the next 10 minutes or lose the Pacific War. He makes a decision that will change history. 6 months earlier, Pearl Harbor burned. The Japanese Navy ruled the Pacific with an iron fist, their carrier fleet undefeated, unstoppable, seemingly invincible. They'd conquered half of Asia. The Philippines fell. Singapore surrendered. The Dutch East Indies collapsed. America's Pacific Fleet lay crippled in Hawaiian waters. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, planned his masterpiece: the invasion of Midway Atoll. A tiny speck of coral 300 miles northwest of Hawaii, Midway served as America's last defensive outpost in the Central Pacific. Take Midway, and Hawaii itself would be vulnerable. But Yamamoto wanted more than territory. He wanted to draw out the American carriers, the ones that escaped Pearl Harbor, and destroy them in a decisive battle. He brought overwhelming force: 4 fleet carriers, 11 battleships, 16 cruisers, and 46 destroyers, the largest naval armada since Jutland. Against this juggernaut, America had 3 carriers. Just 3. The USS Enterprise, the USS Hornet, and the USS Yorktown, hastily repaired from damage at Coral Sea, held together by prayers and welding. The rules were simple. Whoever spotted the enemy carriers first would win. Carrier warfare was a deadly game of hide-and-seek where the loser burned. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet, had one advantage Yamamoto didn't know about. American code breakers had cracked the Japanese naval codes. Nimitz knew Yamamoto was coming. He knew when, he knew where, and he positioned his 3 carriers northeast of Midway, waiting in ambush. Wade McClusky didn't look like a hero. The 39-year-old from Buffalo, New York, was Enterprise's Air Group Commander, a position he'd held for exactly 3 weeks. Before that, he'd been a fighter pilot, not a dive bomber specialist. He wore reading glasses. His hairline was receding. He looked more like an accountant than a warrior. But McClusky had something more valuable than youth: experience. A Naval Academy graduate, he'd spent 15 years learning his craft. He understood navigation, weather, and the geometry of naval warfare. He was methodical, careful, analytical. His pilots called him Wade, unusual familiarity in the Navy's rigid hierarchy. But McClusky earned respect through competence, not rank. On the morning of June 4th, McClusky carried the weight of command. 32 dive bombers and their crews depended on his navigation. The Enterprise depended on his judgment. America depended on his success. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron couldn't have been more different. The commander of Hornet's Torpedo Squadron 8 was part Sioux, raised in South Dakota, known for his intensity and temper. Where McClusky was cautious, Waldron was aggressive. Where McClusky analyzed, Waldron attacked. Waldron flew the TBD Devastator, a torpedo bomber so slow, so vulnerable, that pilots called it a flying coffin. Top speed, 115 miles per hour. The Japanese Zero fighter could do 330. Everyone knew the math. Waldron knew it better than most. The night before the battle, he wrote a letter to his wife. He told her he expected to die. He told her he loved her. He sealed the envelope and gave it to a friend. Then he briefed his squadron. "If there's only one plane left to make the final run in, I want that man to go in and get a hit." 15 men flew with Waldron in Torpedo 8. 14 would be dead by noon. The battle began at dawn. Japanese carriers launched the first strike, 108 aircraft screaming toward Midway Atoll. American land-based planes counterattacked in desperate, uncoordinated waves. Marine fighters, Army bombers, Navy torpedo planes. The Japanese shot them all down. Zero fighters swarmed like hornets. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky with black bursts. American planes tumbled into the sea, trailing smoke and fire. Attack after attack failed. Not one bomb hit a Japanese carrier. By 9 a.m., the situation looked grim. The Japanese carriers had recovered their Midway strike force and were preparing a second wave. But Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the carrier fleet, received troubling news. American ships spotted to the northeast. Nagumo faced a dilemma. His planes were armed with land attack bombs, useless against ships. Rearming would take an hour of vulnerability. He made the decision. Rearm for a naval strike. On the carrier decks, organized chaos erupted. Sailors hauled bombs below, other crews brought up torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs. Fuel lines snaked across the decks. Armed aircraft sat wingtip to wingtip. The carriers became floating bombs. Nagumo didn't know that American dive bombers were already in the air, hunting for him. McClusky had launched from Enterprise at 7 a.m. with 32 SBD Dauntless dive bombers. The plan was simple. Fly to the projected intercept point, find the Japanese carriers, and attack. But when McClusky reached the intercept point at 9:20 a.m., he found empty ocean. Nothing. No carriers, no destroyers, no smoke on the horizon. The Japanese fleet had changed course. McClusky's fuel gauge showed 60% remaining. Standard doctrine said turn back at 50%. He'd already pushed past the point of no return for some of his aircraft. Every minute flying away from Enterprise meant one less minute to find his way home. His radio crackled. Other squadrons reported they were turning back. McClusky calculated the angles, the speeds, the possibilities. If the Japanese had turned toward Midway for their attack, they would have turned back northeast after launching. That meant he banked left, southwest. 29 aircraft followed him. 3 turned back, fuel tanks reading empty. Nobody knew if McClusky was right. John Waldron didn't wait for permission. Hornets dive bombers flew one direction. Waldron's instinct said the Japanese carriers lay another way. He broke formation, taking Torpedo Squadron 8 on a different heading. He was right. At 9:20 a.m., the exact moment McClusky found empty ocean, Waldron spotted 4 Japanese carriers steaming in formation. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, the cream of the Imperial Navy. 15 obsolete torpedo bombers against 4 carriers and 50 Zero fighters. Waldron pushed his throttle forward. The TBD Devastator had to fly low and slow to drop torpedoes, straight and level at 100 feet at 110 miles per hour for over a minute. Every second in that vulnerable approach, you're a target. The Zero's dove. Waldron's wingman exploded first, then another, and another. Zeros raked the slow-moving bombers with cannon fire. Devastators cartwheeled into the sea. Some burned, some simply disintegrated. Waldron kept flying. His plane shuddered as bullets tore through the fuselage. His gunner slumped, killed instantly. Fuel streamed from punctured tanks. The engine coughed, smoking. Waldron pressed on. He closed to 1,000 yards from the nearest carrier. His right wing caught fire. The controls went slack. The Devastator rolled left and dove toward the water. John Waldron's plane hit the Pacific at 200 miles per hour. Ensign George Gay, the last pilot alive from Torpedo Squadron 8, watched his commander die. Gay's gunner was already dead. His plane was shot to pieces. But he continued his torpedo run, dropped his torpedo, which missed, and crash-landed in the ocean 100 yards from a Japanese carrier. He hid under his seat cushion and watched the battle unfold. Behind Waldron, more torpedo squadrons arrived. Enterprise's Torpedo 6, Yorktown's Torpedo 3. They attacked with the same courage and met the same fate. 41 torpedo bombers attacked the Japanese carriers that morning. 35 were shot down. Not one torpedo hit. The sacrifice seemed pointless, a waste, a tragedy. But something critical had happened. Every Zero fighter had descended to wave-top level to massacre the torpedo bombers. The sky above the carriers was empty. Empty of fighters, empty of defenders, empty of everything except one man still searching, his fuel gauge reading critical, his tanks nearly dry. Wade McClusky. McClusky checks his watch. 10 a.m. He's been in the air for 3 hours. The fuel situation is beyond critical. It's catastrophic. Pilots are hand signaling that their tanks are empty. Some will have to ditch in the ocean, even if they turn back right now. The empty sea stretches endlessly below. McClusky makes a choice. 5 more minutes. 5 minutes southwest, then he'll turn back and accept failure. His eyes scan the horizon methodically, sector by sector. The sun glints off the waves. Clouds cast shadows on the water. Nothing. 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 Wait. A white line cuts through the blue. A ship's wake. A single Japanese destroyer, racing northeast at full speed. McClusky understands immediately. The destroyer is chasing someone. The Japanese have rules. Destroyers stay with the carriers, except when rescuing downed pilots or chasing submarines. Follow that wake, he whispers to himself. He banks right, following the white line across the water. The dive bombers follow him, their fuel gauges bouncing on empty. 10:20 a.m. The clouds part. There, 4 carriers steaming in perfect formation. Sitting ducks. Decks crowded with aircraft. Fuel lines exposed. Bombs and torpedoes stacked everywhere. The Japanese are preparing to launch their strike against the American carriers. In 60 seconds, those decks will be empty and the carriers will be maneuvering at high speed, dodging and weaving, their fighters climbing to intercept. McClusky has 60 seconds. He doesn't hesitate. Hand signals flash between aircraft. Pilots check their dive brakes. Bombardiers arm their 1,000-pound bombs. McClusky picks his target. Kaga, the second carrier in line. He noses over into his dive. The altimeter unwinds. 10,000 feet. 8,000. 6,000. The carrier grows in his bomb sight. He can see individual sailors running across the deck. Aircraft packed wingtip to wingtip. Fuel trucks. Bombs stacked in neat rows. 4,000 feet. 3,000. The Japanese see them now. Alarm bells clang. Anti-aircraft guns swivel upward. But it's too late. Far too late. 2,000 feet. McClusky's bomb sight centers on Kaga's flight deck. His thumb hovers over the release button. The carrier fills his entire vision. 1,500 feet. Release. The 1,000-pound bomb drops away. McClusky pulls hard on the stick, feeling the G-forces crush him into his seat. The Dauntless pulls out of the dive at 500 feet, so close he can see the faces of Japanese sailors staring up at him. Behind him, 29 more bombs fall. The first bomb hits Kaga's flight deck at 10:22 a.m. It punches through the wooden deck and explodes in the hangar below, right next to fully fueled aircraft. The explosion sets off a chain reaction. Fuel ignites, bombs explode, torpedoes cook off. Kaga transforms from a warship into a volcano in seconds. The second bomb hits near the island superstructure. The third hits aft, igniting more planes. Fire spreads across the deck like spilled gasoline, consuming everything in its path. Sailors jump overboard, their uniforms burning. 3 miles away, Akagi, Admiral Nagumo's flagship, suffers the same fate. Yorktown's dive bombers, arriving at the exact same moment by sheer coincidence, plaster her with bombs. One hits the central elevator. The explosion blows the elevator platform 100 feet into the air. It comes down like a guillotine, crushing aircraft and men beneath it. Akagi's captain orders the magazines flooded. Too late. Secondary explosions rip through the ship. The Emperor's portrait, the sacred symbol of Japan, is evacuated in a whaleboat as the flagship burns out of control. 4 miles south, Soryu takes 3 bombs in quick succession. Her flight deck erupts in flames. Aviation fuel creates a river of fire that pours through blown-out bulkheads into the decks below. 5 minutes. In 5 minutes, 3 Japanese fleet carriers transform from fearsome weapons into funeral pyres. McClusky's pilots, fuel tanks empty, turn east and nurse their aircraft back toward Enterprise. Some won't make it. They'll ditch in the ocean and pray for rescue. But they've done the impossible. They've turned the tide of the Pacific War. Below, George Gay, still floating in the water, still hiding under his seat cushion, watches all 3 carriers burn. He watches Japanese destroyers circle the infernos, trying to rescue survivors. He watches the smoke rise into a perfect blue sky. He realizes, Torpedo Squadron 8 didn't die for nothing. They pulled the fighters down, they created the opening. Their sacrifice gave McClusky his chance. Kaga sinks first, going down at 7:25 p.m. with 800 men still aboard. Soryu follows 2 hours later, her hull glowing red-hot, ammunition exploding even as she slips beneath the waves. Akagi fights until morning. Admiral Nagumo, tears streaming down his face, orders her scuttled. Japanese destroyers fire torpedoes into their own flagship. She sinks at dawn on June 5th. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, launches a counterattack and badly damages Yorktown. But American dive bombers find Hiryu in the afternoon. 4 bombs reduce her to a burning wreck. She sinks the next morning. 4 fleet carriers, the heart of Japanese naval power, gone. Japan loses 248 aircraft and over 3,000 men, including many of their most experienced pilots. Pilots who took years to train. Pilots who couldn't be replaced. America loses Yorktown, 150 aircraft, and 307 men. The strategic calculus of the Pacific War shifts in 5 minutes. Admiral Yamamoto, aboard his battleship 300 miles away, receives the reports in stunned silence. The carriers are gone. The invasion is canceled. His fleet retreats under cover of darkness. Japan will never threaten Hawaii again. The defensive war is over. Now comes the advance. Wade McClusky lands on Enterprise with 5 gallons of fuel remaining. He climbs out of his cockpit, legs shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. His crew chiefs swarm the aircraft, counting bullet holes. 17 holes in his plane. 1 round passed within inches of his head. The Enterprise Air Group gathers in the ready room. Pilots report their bomb hits, their kills, their observations. The intelligence officers scribble notes. Nobody fully understands what happened yet. The radio intercepts are confused. Multiple carrier names, conflicting reports. Some observers think only 2 carriers were hit. Others insist it was 3. The full picture emerges slowly over the next 24 hours. Japanese radio traffic goes silent, always a sign of disaster. Reconnaissance planes spot oil slicks and debris fields. Survivors are picked up and interrogated. Finally, the truth becomes clear. 4 carriers destroyed. The Japanese Navy crippled. Some officers initially questioned McClusky's decision to continue southwest when doctrine said turn back. That 5-minute extension burned fuel they couldn't afford. 3 pilots ditched and required rescue, but McClusky's instinct, following that destroyer wake, found the carriers at the exact moment they were most vulnerable. 5 minutes earlier, and the fighters would have been airborne. 5 minutes later, and the carriers would have launched their strike and maneuvered to safety. 5 minutes decided everything. The Battle of Midway wasn't won by superior technology or overwhelming force. It was won by sacrifice, intuition, and courage. John Waldron and Torpedo Squadron 8 flew into certain death, knowing their obsolete planes had no chance. But they drew the defenders down, creating the opening that changed history. Wade McClusky broke the rules, flying past the point of safe return, gambling everything on an instinct, following a single destroyer wake across an empty ocean. George Gay, floating alone in hostile waters, survived to tell the story. Together, they demonstrated something the Japanese High Command never understood. American forces didn't need to be perfect. They needed to be brave, adaptable, and willing to break the rules when the situation demanded it. The Japanese Navy never recovered from Midway. They built new carriers, trained new pilots, but the mystique of invincibility was shattered. The psychological impact was devastating. If 4 carriers could be destroyed in 5 minutes, nothing was safe. Japan spent the next 3 years retreating. Admiral Yamamoto survived Midway, but died a year later when American fighters, guided by decoded Japanese messages, ambushed his transport plane over the Solomon Islands. He understood better than most. Midway was the beginning of the end. McClusky received the Navy Cross for his actions. He survived the war, retired as a Rear Admiral, and died in 1976. He rarely spoke about Midway, uncomfortable with praise. He always redirected credit to his pilots, especially to the torpedo squadrons that sacrificed everything. But historians know the truth. Wade McClusky's 5-minute decision to fly 5 more minutes southwest to follow that destroyer wake was the most consequential tactical decision of the Pacific War. George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, was rescued 30 hours after his plane went down. He spent the rest of his life honoring his fallen squadron mates, telling their story, ensuring their sacrifice wasn't forgotten. Every year, on June 4th, he would raise a glass to John Waldron and 14 other men who flew into hell without hesitation. Walk into the Naval Academy today and you'll find paintings of Midway covering the walls. Dive bombers plunging through clouds, carriers burning on a blue sea, the white wake of a destroyer leading attackers to their target. Study naval warfare anywhere in the world, and Midway is the case study. How carrier combat works, how battles turn on seconds and inches, how courage and sacrifice matter more than firepower. The heroes of Midway taught us several truths. Sometimes the rules must be broken. McClusky flew past the safe return point because returning with full bomb loads meant losing the war. Sometimes sacrifice creates opportunity. Torpedo Squadron 8 died so that dive bombers could live. Sometimes a single decision changes history. Following that destroyer wake, flying 5 more minutes, trusting instinct over doctrine. The Pacific War lasted 3 more years after Midway. Island by island, battle by battle, America advanced westward. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. But Midway was the turning point. The moment Japan's advance stopped and the retreat began. 4 carriers burning, 15 torpedo bombers sacrificed. 5 minutes that saved a war. The heroes of Midway remind us that history turns on individual courage. Not armies, not weapons, but people. Pilots and sailors who do their duty even when the odds are impossible, even when survival seems unlikely, even when nobody would blame them for turning back. John Waldron, leading his squadron into death. Wade McClusky, trusting his instinct over doctrine. George Gay, surviving to tell the story. And 14 other men whose names deserve to be remembered. William Creamer, John Torman, Ulvert Moore, Francis O'Flaherty, Raymond Moore, Robert Miles, Otway Creasy Jr., Tom Petty, George Campbell, Harold Ellison, Henry Kenyon Jr., William Evans, Grant Teets, and Horace Dobbs. The heroes of Midway, the men who changed the world in 5 minutes.